in the sky. It's a bird.
It's a plane!
This is The Never-Ending Battle, a Superman ranking podcast that takes a look at the Man of Steel and his extended family as they carry out their never-ending battle for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. I'm your host, Jordan, and I want to welcome you all to the very first inaugural episode of the show. Now, this episode is a rare collector's item. It's the first issue, after all. I hope you bought enough blind bags to get that special 1 in 1,000 foil variant, or if anything, you at least enjoy the show you get. Now, this is the first episode of the show, and today, I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to be talking about the many secret origins of Superman, or at least the post-crisis origins of Superman, because there are too many versions of this thing to do all in one episode, and I want to save some for future times. Now, this show was something I've been cooking up for a while. I've been trying to do a Superman-related thing for many years, and trying to find the correct format was always a thing that eluded me. Now, I've been wanting to do some sort of podcast for a while, and I've fallen into love with a bunch of comic book podcasts. Things like Battle the Atom over there at Comics XF, and their sister show, Bat Chat with Matt and Will. Jay and Miles Explain the X-Men, and all the fun stuff at the Fire and Water Podcast Network just really got me into the idea of doing a comic book podcast. And never once came to my mind to do a Superman podcast until this past summer. Obviously, with this past summer, the Superman movie by James Gunn had just released, and I found myself in the comic shop just talking to, random people, just striking up conversations as we were looking at the various comics, and they were asking me, what's some good Superman comics to read? And I was like, well, there are some really good ones out there, and I found myself ranking them, and I was like, oh, boy, that was so much more sense to actually talk about this as a podcast. And I'm like, I could just make a ranking podcast, much like the Bat Chat and Battle of the Atom, but do with the Superman theme. And I thought, yeah, that would actually really work. Superman's got a very diverse, long history. There's a lot of side characters. There's a lot of things going on. And doing it as a ranking podcast instead of a index podcast or a recap podcast or even a critical analysis podcast, which is nothing wrong with those, it would allow me to look at different eras of Superman in a way that it's really hard to do in not a linear fashion. Because if I wanted to do a ranking or at least a retrospective of Superman, I would find myself doing a lot of linear fashion and then just mission creep hits. This allows me to touch different eras of Superman without getting too bored. Now, let's explain how the podcast is going to work. So, like I said, this is a ranking podcast. So what that means, for those who keep hearing me say this term and I don't know what it means, what it is I read every week. I read and talk about 3 Superman stories. Now, that could be single issues, it can be multi-issue arcs, it could be a lot of issues, depending on how much I'm willing to put into it. And I take a look at those 3 stories and I rank them from best to worst, but not just within the episode. I put them on one gigantic sprawling list. Now, I don't have a name for this list yet that I'm currently in love with, but that will come eventually at some point. I know it will. But this is the big list of Superman comics from best to worst. Now, when it comes to rankings, my rules are simple. If it's a Superman story, if it's Superman related, has a Kryptonian, honestly, if it's got an issue with Superman in it, be it Swamp Thing or Cave Carson has a cybernetic eye, I'm going to talk about it because those are some really good comics out there. Now, because it is me doing the rankings and any guest that may have it, future episodes, the rankings are subjective. Now, there's some basic rules I do follow, so there's some objectivity to it. There's going to be stuff like enjoyment. There's going to be significance in terms of history, if it's a major milestone story, if it's a story that would play out much more importantly to the canon of Superman, the quality of the craft that goes into it based on the writing or the art or something particular. Now, the third rule, and this is the most important rule, so I'm going to lean into the microphone for everybody at home or in their car. This is just a show, and you really should relax. This is just a show for fun. This is make-em-ups, folks. And the part of the fun is having these weird discussions. Now, this is the inaugural episode of The Never-Ending Battle. So what I wanted to do is tackle 3 of Superman's post-crisis origins. Now, post-crisis is a term to describe an era of DC Comics taking place post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, number 12, until the end of Flashpoint. This particular era of DC Comics is known for basically revitalizing the brand and changing the direction. Now, post-crisis, the whole multiverse kind of crashes down on itself and into a singular timeline. And when that happens, all the various alternate Earths go away, and DC takes this as an opportunity to revamp a lot of their characters. Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman get revamped origins, but Superman and Wonder Woman get some of the major changes. And Superman has probably the most drastic, at least I would argue, one of the more drastic origin changes for a main character, considering he was the major going concern at DC. And that's really the focus of today's episode. How DC had to revamp Superman in the 80s, and in the process spends the next two reboots in the 2000s to undo what they did in the 1980s. This is one of the major changes because we end up seeing a Superman who takes a drastic break from what we would know as the Silver Age Superman in early Bronze Age, changes him almost Marvel style. And some of those are for the best, some of those for the worst. And really what's interesting when you look at all three of today's stories together, you're going to see how Superman's origin has unfolded and has it been retconned into different things for different artist purposes. And that's what makes this so compelling and interesting of a story. Now, let's get into today's story. Round 1. Superman, The Man of Steel, printed as The Man of Steel Volume 1, numbers 1 through 6. The Man of Steel is written and penciled by John Byrne, with inks provided by Dick Giordano, who also serves as executive editor. Colors by Tom Zucco and lettered by John Costanta. The series itself is edited by Andrew Helferts. The story. A young Clark Kent finds himself having to quickly adapt to his amazing gifts and abilities while growing up in Smallville, Kansas. After learning that his parents found him in a spacecraft of some sort as a child, and deciding to no longer stand by with the gifts that he's been given, Clark leaves the confines of Smallville, Kansas in favor of the world before settling in the bustling city of tomorrow, Metropolis. Tired of operating in the shadows, Clark decides to take up the new identity of Superman in his quest to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. So, I was actually surprised by how solid of a story it is. I mean, I shouldn't be too surprised. John Byrne, for what it's worth, is a competent creator, and especially in this point in his career. You can read a John Byrne story, and it would have a decent construction to it. And I can see why, for a lot of people, this was the Superman story. Formative time period, what comes about when you're coming of age. It also is a nice clean break from the stuff in the Silver Age, because I've been reading a lot of the Superman leading up until post-Crisis, and that Superman stuff is very different. To say the least. I like it, but it's not like what you would think a Superman comic would be. And I can see quickly why DC would want to change this. Now, in preparation for this episode, I actually did some digging for interviews because I'm that kind of person who likes to look for these things. And part of the things I found while doing my research is that I found some articles from contemporary fan magazines and periodicals at the time, namely Amazing Heroes number 96. Now, this is a comic magazine that was coming out through the late 80s, early into the 90s. And in this particular issue, again, Amazing Heroes number 96, writer Peter Sanderson interviews John Byrne and Marv Wolfman. Now, Marv Wolfman is an editor at DC with a turned writer, and he would actually be the one, along with John Byrne, handling the post-Crisis Superman. He would be one writing the Adventures of Superman series that would also be coming about during this time. But Sanderson is interviewing Byrne and Wolfman for this upcoming reboot, and it was becoming clear that, based on their words, that the Superman reboot proved to be a real challenge. While there was unanimity amongst the various folks at DC of what actually needs to be done, and the fact that Superman needed to be revamped, there was problems about how to get to that point in the revamp. After a period of developmental hell, things changed when Marv Wolfman learned that John Byrne was about to go into freelance for the first time in ages since Byrne joined Marvel back in the late 70s. And it was Wolfman who ends up making the big push to get Byrne on board for this reboot. Now, I've been mentioning John Byrne up to this point, and you may be wondering, in 2025, why of all people in the world, John Byrne was the one they would seek out for a Superman reboot? Let's be clear. John Byrne's industry status in 1986 is at an all-time high. He has hit after hit after hit. He has nothing but done banger after banger. He is an artist who works alongside Chris Claremont for both the Dark Phoenix Saga and the Days of Future Past, two of the most important and seminal X-Men stories of all time. That's John Byrne on those books. He is the one who does the art. He co-plots those stories. He is that important. He draws money. Now, nowadays, we know John Byrne sucks. John Byrne, the person, is a hate-filled man. Now, this is not some hearsay and allegations. This is using his own words that he has publicly stated online. He is terminally online, and my gosh, he should probably have learned to not hit the send button. So John Byrne has had numerous, and on the record, again, I cannot state this enough, on the record, tirades against the trans community, against immigrants, and other creators. He is a difficult person to work with and a real overall crank of a person. But in 1986, that information is not very well known. All right. Enough talking about the talent here. Let's talk about the actual story. So this is a weird book. Man of Steel, what I found is while there is a story, the comic itself does not really operate as an origin story. It's a very interesting artifact of its time. It is a 1980s miniseries, and it's easy jumping on point for new readers. What makes it really weird is there's no central plot, in the sense of most time in miniseries these days, issue 1 through issue 6, there is a through line main plot, a plot, while there is no B plot. While there may be B plots and C plots, a plot is obviously clearly defined from issue 1 to the finale, which in this case would be in issue 6. Man of Steel does not do that. Man of Steel feels like what would have been 6 issues of John Byrne's Superman run. And because of it was the style of the time, they decided to set it out as a miniseries that double shipped twice a month. And it was able to kind of get a new status quo and end up being kind of this kicking off point for Action Comics. The new Superman #1 and renumbering of the original Superman on Superman volume as Adventures of Superman, to make 3 Superman ongoings. So really the purpose of the plot here is not so much to be a plot. It is not even a real origin story. Yeah, the first 2 issues are pretty well connected. The third issue is this, because the first issue is Superman learning he has superpowers, Clark Kent learning he has superpowers, and deciding to go to Metropolis, and then taking up the costume of Superman after basically a fan frenzy over this mysterious character who saves a plane crash. So that's the first issue. Second issue is Lois Lane trying to get the story of the century, trying to get an interview with Superman, going out of her way to do it. And Superman ends up beating her to the punch, but Clark Kent beats her to the punch by getting that story of the century. But Superman does talk with Lois and kind of sets up some basic stuff and gets to know Lois. And we start seeing information about like how he's an American son. He may be from another world, but he's definitely American. Then we go to the third issue. And the third issue is this Batman issue. And the Batman issue is different. Basically, we see the first post-crisis meeting of Batman and Superman, and the relationship is redefined. And this is one of those things that Byrne really wanted to push, and DC editorial obviously did as well. No longer was Batman and Superman BFFs. They were frenemies at best. I just don't care for that, and that's going to be an issue as we'll see in future episodes in the Never Ending Battle when I talk about different Batman and Superman meetups. The early ones especially, there's a lot of this antagonism, and it rings hollow because we know what Superman and Batman are in other media, and also we see them here, and it's just like, fourth issue is probably one of the best issues. That is when Luthor finally comes back to town and kind of wraps up really what would be the year 1 story. Because the Batman interlude basically takes place at a time where Superman is still taking care of Metropolis, and Luthor's out of town. He's in another country where he can't get contacted. So he doesn't know what's going on. And then we see in issue 4, he finds out, man, Superman's kind of taking my place as the, person of the city. And that really angers him. It leads to this big confrontation, and probably the best part of the comic is where Luthor tries to buy off Superman, and Superman publicly rejects him. And when he publicly rebukes Luthor takes it so personally that he tries to get him killed and actually ends up getting arrested in the process. And that one's pretty wild. It's a really good story. It's got the best bit where Luthor has to take the perp walk and get arraigned in court in Metropolis Police Department. Issue 5, though, is an issue where we see a Bizarro. So again, this is why I'm talking about the plot structure of this comic is not really consistent. We have 3 fairly interconnected stories with issues 1, 2, and 4. Issue 3 is kind of an interlude. Issue 5 is the Bizarro issue, and it's a fantastic issue. It's probably one of the best. It is the best issue of the miniseries. It's far from an actual origin, and it's kind of kind of weird and disjointed. And then the sixth issue kind of wraps it all up, wraps up the plot points in issue one, where Superman actually finds out his true Kryptonian origin, and we see more of Krypton. And it's a good issue, but it definitely feels like they could have arranged the structure a little bit. So the plot structure for this miniseries is a little all over the place. Part of that, I think, comes from the fact that what they're actually trying to do with this story is not so much do a year one type situation where we see a very tightly knit storyline explaining Superman's first year. Instead, we see Superman's first 3 or 4 years, and Byrne's basically trying to get across all these major reboots. There's 11 things that they end up doing with Superman in the reboot, and those are basically what Byrne sets out to do. Use Man of Steel as a vehicle, not so much to tell a story, because there's really not a story here. It's more about, hey, I need to convey to the audience, to the readers, and to new readers, this is the new stuff that Superman is. This is not your father's Superman. This is Superman by the way of John Byrne, which means it's Superman by the way of Marvel in a lot of ways. Now, these sweeping changes don't seem that much, and on some level, because most of us associate these now, we know that Mom and Pa Kent are alive. They're in the Superman movie, much to some criticism of people who don't understand how people talk in rural areas. That aside, most of the stuff actually is what we know as now as Superman rule, but this is actually a really big deal because of John Byrne. Now he pulls a lot of elements from the other movies, and it becomes canonized through just cultural osmosis. And so it's kind of a popular thing. Now, are all those changes necessary? That's a better question. And for my personal opinion, I think a lot of those changes are necessary, though some of them have possible weird things. So the biggest one being the Superman as an American. I like that Superman views himself as Clark Kent first. That Clark Kent is the person that Superman is a disguise. He disguises himself as Superman so he can be the hero he wants to be. He's still heroic, but he is not Superman first, disguising himself as Clark Kent. It's not a mockery. I do appreciate that. And I get the appeal of making Superman less alien, because that's a really ongoing concern that Mark DC had, that Superman was very alien. But putting him as explicitly, and I want to stress this up, when I mean explicit, I mean explicit. There are several pages throughout the entire 6 issues where Superman goes, I'm an American, with full throat patriotic USA, USA, USA fervor. He goes, I'm an American. And this is the 80s. This is the height of the Cold War. I get it. But the problem comes about when you started thinking about John Byrne's beliefs. So as I mentioned earlier, I don't know how many things that John Byrne would go on to say that he fully believed in 1986. People change for the worse and for the better, but sometimes for the worst. But in 2002, in an interview, and presumably an interview about a future story on the today's episode talking about Superman Birthright, Byrne was asked, how does he feel about immigrants who have strong connections to their cultural heritage of their homeland? He called immigrants who are attached to their cultural heritage ungrateful little shits. That's an exact quote from John Byrne. It is irredeemable for Byrne, because that speaks a lot about his character. You should not have to change your identity to live somewhere. And the fact this is coming from John Byrne, Canadian born, naturalized U.S. citizen, irks me, because he is an immigrant too. John Byrne sucks as a human being. So let's talk about, before we get into the ranking, I always like to want to look at a standout moment, the moment of this comic that actually really makes me go, oh yeah, this is worth checking out. Even bad comics have standout moments, and even, good comics have flaws, bad comics have standouts. And every comic has a standout moment. And this one has 2 major ones. Issues 4 and 5. I've already spoke about issue 4 being the most fantastic issue of the story. But issue 5 I want to allude on a little bit more. Issue 5 is the best Bizarro comic of all time, in my personal opinion. Outside of some of the more, fantastical stuff that you would see with Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman Bizarro issues. In issue 5, features a Bizarro that is an imperfect clone of Superman, and he tries to be both Clark Kent and Superman, And not once is he actually called a Bizarro by name because John Byrne is allergic to all things Silver Age and, fun and whimsy. But he still decides that, he makes this a character that is compelling. He is a monsterish person, but he's still got a good heart and he tries to do good things despite being this monstrous appearance. And it gets wonderfully adapted in the Superman the Animated TV series with their Bizarro episode. The very first Bizarro episode in that show does a pretty much a spiritual adaptation. It takes some differences. It ends differently, but it does a really good job of conveying this Bizarro concept that's a little different from what was in the Silver Age, which was a Bizarro world. Instead, we see a Bizarro that is not a perfect clone. And it's kind of this weird, bittersweet ending of a comic, and it just I would have liked to see more of that in the Man of Steel series. And while I've not read all of the Byrne run, I hope there's more issues like that in there because those are moments of just like, I don't know, just bittersweet sorrow, as I keep calling it. This weird, delightful melancholy that I think Byrne really has a good knack for. And he doesn't really lean on it enough, in my opinion. He doesn't do this like sad endings as enough as at least in my taste, at least these kind of sad endings. I don't know. It's a real standout moment. Definitely worth reading. Issues 4 and 5 alone are some of the best issues and almost make this miniseries worth it. Now, this time it is for the ranking. Now, here's the deal. We don't have any comics on the list right now. So we have, what we'll see is there's going to be a big list. I don't have a name for it yet. The unnamed list. And that list is going to be ranked from best to worst of all Superman stories of all time, or right now, there's only one comic on the list. It is the Schrodingers. It is the best and the worst Superman comic of all time. At the same time, it is Man of Steel by John Byrne. Now, this won't last, obviously. We'll see this a little bit later. This comic is, again, not a perfect comic. It is very dated by today's standards. It does not take advantage of some of the miniseries stuff that was even going on at the time, but it will be lapped later by future miniseries that try to do similar things. I don't really care for some of the Superman Batman antagonism, which is just annoying personal pet peeve, but also the things like the Blade and Reagan era politics of Superman. I really just do not like that John Byrne instills into the character here, and it isn't till much later that we see with writers like Roger Stern and Louis Simonson that kind of strip away these little harder edges they try to put on Superman, and I'm much more grateful for it. But overall, currently this is the number one comic on the list because it's the only comic on the list, and that's Superman Man of Steel. Round 2. Superman Birthright. Originally printed as Superman Birthright numbers 1 through 12. Written by Mark Waid. Penciled by Lionel Francis Yu. Inked by Gary Alquilin. With colors by Dave McCraig and letters by Comicraft. The story. Clark Kent has been traveling the world for many years, helping others as both a reporter and a superpowered Avenger. His help often comes at a great cost, as Clark finds himself often ostracized by the people he once saved, who grow fearful of his amazing gifts. Following a suggestion from his mom, Clark would adopt the identity of Superman and head to the city of Metropolis to do the most good. However, Clark's past comes back to haunt him as an old friend and threatens to undo all the good that Superman has done in the world. Can the Man of Tomorrow save Metropolis and find his place in this world? Okay, let's talk some talent real quick. This is Mark Waid. Mark Waid is the Superman expert of DC Comics. He has obviously been doing a ton of Superman comics over the many years. This is his version of the Superman origin story. Now, for Mark Waid's Bonafides with Superman, he writes Kingdom Come, JLA. He ends up also obviously writing Birthright, and he's current writer of both World's Finest and the Action Comics run, where they're talking about Superboy of all things. Now, Mark Waid is a extremely talented writer. He is got a unique voice. He knows how to find the emotional root of a story, and that is no different here in this comic, here in Birthright. Now, Lionel Francis Yu is actually kind of an interesting choice for this book. This is his only major DC credit at this time. Now, he would have some Wildstorm credits in the past, but Lionel Francis Yu is primarily known for his work on both Avengers and X-Men over at Marvel. Now, he really hasn't done much for DC, but he is a very talented artist and one I love to read. He's one of my favorites, and he's one that actually made me even read the new Avengers comic that was coming out around the time of Secret Invasion. Lionel Francis too has a great sense of action, as well as ability to command quiet moments to give the story time to breathe, and really captures this cinematic scope as we see here in Birthright. I think his sense of pacing and action is some of the best in comics, and how he's able to convey emotional beats is some of the finest in any comic you'll find out there. Let's talk about the background to this story. So, much like before, we were talking about post-crisis situations. This is still firmly in the post-crisis, and there's actually not a major line-wide initiative or any kind of major crisis type event that would justify this change, because the last major crisis would have been Zero Hour, and that would have been almost 8 years before the story takes place, and that's not really what's going on here. Instead, this is more based on the success of DC's newest show at the time, Smallville. DC, after seeing the success of Smallville, wanted to create a new Superman Year One type comic for the new readers. Something that was a big art blowout type thing, and something a little bit more of a modern update compared to the more 1980s tinged Man of Steel. Originally, Birthright was intended to be set in an alternate universe, according to Mark Waid, and over time, during the development, was determined that, hey, this should be the new definitive origin for Superman. Waid was set out to reestablish some of the Silver Age elements that was stripped away during the Man of Steel reboot, such as returning Luthor to Smallville, albeit briefly, and tying Luthor's supervillain origin to Clark's. Additionally, Waid would rework the concept of Superman where he is Clark Kent first and Superman second, and is something beyond just being an jingoistic American of the Reagan era. Instead, Clark would be a man of the world, as evident by the fact that when we first meet him in the comic, he's traveling the globe as a freelance reporter while using his powers to save others when necessary, but often he does not want to take power for himself. Instead, he wants to be the person who gives people voice using his own unique privileges. Now, as a consequence of using his power, he often frightens the ones he tries to save with these powers, with his abilities, and that's what causes him to be ostracized and creates a growing sense of isolation. Isolation is the central theme of Birthright here, to be honest with you. This is something that's really interesting and compelling to me in the comic. This is what makes this comic stand out compared to something like Man of Steel or the later story of the night, Secret Origin. The isolation that we see in Birthright is a central theme. It runs throughout the entire 12-issue series, and is something that Waid really plays up with Superman. While Clark does have loving parents, he finds himself feeling alone. Clark often finds himself asking, why was I sent here from my people? And if my parents really loved me, why did they send me here? Why have they not contacted me? Waid is making a very conscious decision to play up that Clark is actually adopted and feels like anyone else who's adopted and who don't know the world they came from. This is not an adoption where Clark can find his origins. He is stars away. He doesn't know what happened to them. He doesn't know why he's there. He is alone in this world. He may have loving, caring family who would do everything for him, but he's alone. That is something we don't really see much in a lot of Superman comics. To some capacity, we do see that a little bit in the Silver Age, where Superman often broods over the fact that he is the last surviving son of Krypton, but gets kind of undercut by the fact that he could go to the Phantom Zone or go back in time or go see his parents or go to New Krypton. Now, Clark's isolation is, like I said, a central theme of the story as both a hero and as a civilian, as Clark. And even as an adult, when he goes into Metropolis working for the Daily Planet, he finds himself isolated from the rest of his peers because they view him as too wholesome, like he's trying too hard. Mark Waid and Lionel Francis Yu's ability to convey this isolation is something that's spectacular to see on the page. We see this way the art does it, because Lionel Francis Yu does play a lot with the cinematic elements. We see at times where Superman is literally by himself with this wide panels that show nobody around him. There's a scene in Metropolis in one of the later issues where Clark is finding himself sitting at a dinner table. He thought they were all eating there. The whole Metropolis newsroom was going to eat. He thought the whole Daily Planet newsroom was going to go eat lunch at this one restaurant. Instead, they lie to him, so they go eat lunch at a different restaurant, and Clark finds himself sitting at a table for 20 by himself. It's cruel and cynical often, but it helps drive home this isolation and drives home really what Clark does in the comic as important to him. There are notable origin changes to Superman throughout this book. Those are basically revamping the Silver Age elements. We see stuff like Superman not only embracing his heritage but actively seeking answers. We see stuff like Superman's first appearance as Superman is not as some masked individual or cloaked individual. This is Superman. He's in the active costume. And the big changes being Luthor being there for the first time as an astrobiologist who studies these alien worlds and starts tying in the technology. We're starting to see a return to not only a more Silver Age Lex Luthor, who is more of a science fiction mad scientist trope. We're starting to see them trying to marry the science fiction with the megalomania billionaire businessman type. And we even see not only Luthor return back to Smallville, we see a Luthor that is a friend to Clark. And that foundational relationship with Luthor is told throughout many issues as we start seeing the past unfold and start understanding that Superman's isolation leads him to try to reach out to somebody who he also feels is isolated, but how they respond to that isolation is totally different. That Luthor is more of a cautionary tale of what goes wrong when somebody is isolated from their world and tries to use that as a chip on their shoulder to do something far much more cynical. Now, Superman Birthright has a lot of changes, the subtle changes to them, but none of the changes feel any more larger than anything else. And as such, Birthright does not feel like a vehicle designed to put over the updated origin stories. This means it addresses one of the major flaws with Man of Steel. It is a ongoing plot structure that has a single narrative that goes from A to B with side plots here and there, but there is a through line you can find in issue 1 all the way through issue 12 that is touched upon, and it carries the story well. So it addresses this major structural issue. It has a single plot that does not weigh itself down trying to introduce any other secondary characters. Yeah, it introduces the Daily Planet staff. Yes, it introduces Luthor, but it is not concerned itself with trying to introduce new villains. We're not seeing a Bizarro. We're not seeing a Metallo. We're not seeing a Parasite. Instead, we just see Luthor. And not only do we see Luthor that is like, yeah, he's going to do a false flag Kryptonian invasion. It ends up being this big plot. Is able to access Superman's history using what was essentially as the Phantom Zone, and able to see that the dark past of Kryptonian's, dark history of Krypton with the more colonial style conquerors that we've obviously in fiction know now, and then kind of really the basis that we see in the Superman movie from James Gunn this past summer. This idea that Krypton was not always this great place. It's something that, yeah, Superman has to deal with, but what Luthor does is he takes these images and manufactures a fake outrage, literally a false flag invasion of Metropolis using Krypton. And that origin is really interesting. It's a lot tighter story, and that makes this much better read, for my opinion. And it takes advantage of the more modern plot structure. And it's honestly the longest, up until more since New 52 run on Action Comics, this is the longest year one style Superman story that we receive. And depending on how you view the New 52 stuff, this is the longest Superman story that we get in terms of origin. Now, because this is the longer one and more modern storytelling takes place, again, Wade and you take advantage of this and develop a much more well-rounded cast. While we don't spend time having to introduce all these major players like, a Batman or Bizarro, like I mentioned, we're able to see more time in the Daily Planet. We see Clark's time as a reporter. We see him be an investigator. We see him interact with the Daily Planet. Daily Planet website updates are often used as a way to show events between major story beats that we don't see in Man of Steel. Man of Steel jumps around a lot with the idea that there's a world going on outside of the pages, which is fantastic, but we're not seeing really what's going on there. Here, we're getting little snippets of, hey, these events are taking place, these are going on. We're not seeing them on page. Superman is still Superman. He's not concerned explicitly with all this stuff with Luthor. He's still doing Superman stuff, but that's not the point of this story. But we're still there. It's still happening. Jingle jangle. Look at the keys. It's still happening, but it's not done in a way that's condescending. And I think it's really effective. Now, another theme, in addition to this isolation that we see in Birthright, is Birthright is very much a post 9/11 story. It comes out in 2002 through 2003, after all. It is a post 9/11 war on terror story. The Luthor that we see here has taken advantage of people's insecurity. He's doing stuff like rolling out drone anti-terrorist aircraft into the city. He's carrying out literal false flag operations. I cannot emphasize it enough. He's carrying out false flag operations to seem like the hero. He is trying to manipulate outrage so he can seize power. People willingly give him power. He doesn't have to seize it directly. People will vote to give it to him. Now, there's some things in here that kind of give you a sense of what it's like to live in the era that it takes place in. We see stuff like comments about the yellow and orange terrorist advisory system that comes around during the Bush era. This is a big part of the background. We see that we're currently on a yellow alert, which means garbage at the time. And kind of help drive this point home, there's one quote that stands out to me, and that is from a cab driver talking to Clark as Clark is pulling into the city. And the cab driver goes, and talking to Clark, who's noticing that, man, there's a lot of bad stuff going around here. And the cab driver goes, "We do what we must to feel safer, yes. One longs for the past, when the people of the city seemed fearless. Alas, the present is poisoned with anxiety." And damn it, Wade hits that feeling what it's like to live in the United States or in the world, but live in this world since 2001. For my younger listeners, the younger members of the audience, you may not know what that was like. You've always known this. And I'm almost too young to remember what life was like before September 11th, not in 2001. But I do remember it. And I know what it's like to feel like we are constantly under anxiety. There's an anxious weight on this world that we literally cannot look up anymore. Not because of our phones, but because the world is poisoned so much that we have to look at our phones, and looking up is just too much to bear. Narratively, the structure of the story focuses a lot on Clark not only being a hero, but understanding his place in the universe. As I mentioned, the isolation is a major component here, and coming to terms with his abandonment. There are a lot of focus on being Superman as adopted here. And I think that's an overall much more effective angle to take to Superman. When it comes to when it comes to retelling origin stories, I feel like there needs to be a new angle. While Man of Steel may not have been necessarily my cup of tea, it at least takes a new angle to the Superman origin compared to what came before it. And Birthright does the same thing here. We see a different beat to Superman. Instead of seeing a Superman who just goes to the same origin that we always see, we see a Superman who does feel alone, a Superman that does feel like an outsider, but he does not take that as a way to be evil. Wade intentionally sets him as a parallel against Luthor. Luthor is an outsider just as much as Clark. He feels like he's alone in this world, and even though he has people reaching out to him literally in the form of Clark trying to make friends, Luthor rather focus on his perceived slights and trying to get his form of justice over, that he no longer feels like he's being slighted anymore. And I think that's a really interesting parallel because Clark has that. He's also isolated, but he uses it instead of to drive him to be malicious. Despite having all the gifts he could be, the literal ruler of this world, he instead decides to be a savior. All right, time for the standout moment of the story. Now, there's a lot of standout moments in this series. I loved all 12 issues. They were fantastic moments. I could easily talk about issue 2, where Clark is talking to the African politician, and we basically see a recreation of Action Comics #1. I love seeing that. But the real standout moment for me is at the end, in Birthright #12, at the very end of the story, in the final confrontation between Clark and Lex, and they're standing over each other. Clark is currently dealing with kryptonite poisoning. He is sick, and his whole scheme has fallen apart, but Lex is not willing to go back down. We see the Phantom Zone. Lex is trying to communicate with the Kryptonians, try to get an answer, try to figure out something he can do to get his revenge on Superman, and try to take one more step, try to rule the world. Instead, what we end up seeing is Superman's also in that room, and he's able to communicate through the Phantom Zone technology, and he's able to send a message to his parents in the final moments of Krypton. And this is after they've already launched Clark off into space to save him. All of this comes to a head as the Phantom Zone and everything's going around him. The place is falling apart. but he ends up reaching out and relaying a message to his birth parents that he made it. He's okay. And his birth parents are able to see him with their own eyes before destruction overtakes them, before the doom that comes to Krypton and its fated explosion goes off. They look at their own baby boy grown up with their eyes, with a face that they never would get to see, and see him go, I made it. I'm okay. It destroyed me reading that, and it's gut-wrenching. As a parent of 3 children, one of which is adopted, watching that unfold and this isolation, I don't know, it just speaks to me. It's resonant that Clark comes full circle to his journey. And that is some good freaking comics, and it makes it the best ending to one of these things. And that's why Mark Waid is one of the best writers ever, because he hits those emotional beats in a way that you cannot find with other writers very often. He finds that one special note and he nails it, and it's fantastic. With that said, it's time to rank Superman Birthright on the unnamed list. Obviously, this is a much better comic than Man of Steel. Nothing against Man of Steel necessarily. Man of Steel is a fine comic for what it is, but it is very much a product of its time. Superman Birthright is also a product of its time, but it is of a time that feels relevant even to this day, even though it is over 20 years old. It is, to me, the best Superman origin. Unfortunately, to preview what I think of the next one, but it is the best Superman origin. It is one of the best Superman stories of all time. And as of right now, it is the number one Superman story of all time. It is now the new, current, best Superman story of all time. And to be honest with you, it's probably going to stay that way for quite a while. This is easily the best Superman comic you can get. You can find it in many different ways. You subscribe to DC Ultra Infinite. You can get it for the year. You can get a free, quote unquote, free copy. They'll send you a copy. That's how I got mine. You can also get it from the compact editions. You can go buy it in the stores. It is a fantastic comic. It is well worth the purchase. You will never regret it. Round 3. And our final story of the night is Superman's Secret Origin, published as Superman's Secret Origin numbers 1 through 6, written by Geoff Johns, penciled by Gary Frank, with inks by John Sibbel, colors by Brad Anderson, with Steve Wands on letters. The story. In the town of Smallville, Clark Kent comes of age, coming to terms with the powers and abilities from beyond the stars. He adopts the moniker of Superboy and finds kindred spirits in the time-traveling teen superheroes, the Legion of Superheroes. Along the way, in Smallville, he finds an arch-nemesis in the teen Lex Luthor. Fast-forwarding 10 years, Clark finds himself interviewing in Metropolis for the failing Daily Planet newspaper. Along the way, he also saves the day as Superman. While Metropolis may not be as glamorous as it used to be, Clark gives his residents a reason to hope yet again, which unfortunately angers the now adult Lex Luthor and his loaded god complex. Can the Man of Tomorrow bring Metropolis back to its former glory? Okay, it's time to talk some talent now. Let's talk about Geoff Johns. Now, Geoff Johns is the premier DC architect of the mid-2000s. You could not go 1 week without seeing a Geoff Johns related title. Either he was co-writing or writing, I felt like. And he writes, and that's due to the fact that he writes lengthy runs on books like Action Comics, Teen Titans, Justice Society, Green Lantern, 52, and many, many, many other titles. He is the big deal. Now, this also goes on to the fact that even into the new 52, he writes a run on Justice League for the entire 52 issues, for the most part, and includes a stint on Superman. Not Action Comics, but Superman proper. He ends up being DC's chief creative officer. He ends up trying to be the Kevin Feige of the DC movies and fails miserably at it, mainly due to the fact he is dogged by allegations following the events of the filming of Justice League, where he's accused by actors of basically having being racist on set. He largely fades out of DC because as he faces allegations of while I do love Geoff Johns' comics, obviously it kind of burns out. His run on JSA and Action Comics are some of my favorites. His run on Action Comics is one of the things that gets me into comics in the modern era. I have a soft spot for a lot of Geoff Johns stuff, but I have to kind of rectify the fact that he maybe not been a very good person on set, and he never really fully apologized or tried to address those issues. Yeah, it sucks. Now let's talk about Gary Frank. Gary Frank, he's a very popular Superman artist. Not for me, though. I I don't really care for his style. See, while Gary Frank is known to be a Superman artist and has obviously drawn many other comics, including Hulk, which actually he looks really good in Hulk, I'm not a fan of Gary Frank's Superman because he notably renders Superman to just be Christopher Reeves, which, don't get me wrong, it looks impressive and I understand the appeal of it. Don't get me wrong. I'm just not a fan of it. I don't read comics for likenesses, and to me, Christopher Reeve, while he's a major, tremendous character of Superman, his work as Superman is amazing. That is not the thing that should define Christopher Reeve or define Superman. I think it does a disadvantageous for both the character and the actor. And I never could get into it, and it always kind of comes off poorly. It's basically his art looks like skin stretched over a skeleton, but not much in terms of musculature because he's so committed to doing art in the sense of drawing off the reference of Christopher Reeve. He's trying to be photorealistic to an extent that his art and facial expressions often suffer. All right, let's talk about the background now. Now, the reason for this comic's existence. So, at this point, we have had 2 Superman origins. By the way, we have not really had that many other redefining origins for the other characters. Because what we end up happening is, over time, that DC quickly realizes that yes, while we needed to revamp Superman, probably shouldn't have got rid of a bunch of the Silver Age stuff. Because turns out the Silver Age stuff is what people like about Superman. They love that beyond wacky Silver Age things. And that's kind of the thing. So Jeff Johns kind of earns a reputation as a continuity fixer. And while Superman continuity is not a mess by any means, he has earned his reputation as being, again, this continuity fixer by working on Hawkman, trying to fix that problem, and that's a whole can of worms. He also tries to fix the whole Hal Jordan turning evil thing. It's fine. It's not my favorite reasoning, but hey, if you got to kind of get it to go there, there's worse things to do than rip off Dark Phoenix. So, it's fine. So he decides he's going to redo the Superman origin. Now, Jeff Johns, in addition to earning a reputation of being a kind of a continuity fixer, is also earned the reputation of being somebody who prefers Silver Age elements over the modern. And that is really the big challenge we see here and what we really see play out. Now, Secret Origin shares a name with another Jeff Johns story arc, and that is Green Lantern Secret Origin. In that one, Green Lantern Secret Origin, Jeff Johns reestablishes Green Lantern's origin in the post-crisis world, and basically tries to take care of some of the issues that may have popped up since Emerald Dawn was written, and also write a story that can be printed because Emerald Dawn, it can't be reprinted. So he tries to do a new version of the Green Lantern origin, and also it helps serve as a kind of a prologue for the Blackest Night event that's about to come out. So yeah, it kind of plays a good role of being a new origin, and it redefines the character in some way. It provides new context and tries to do something new with it. That is something both Man of Steel, for what it's worth, my issues aside, it does recontextualize Superman. It does new things with the character to some extent. Birthright does a whole lot more with that idea. It's a Superman origin story, but it does something with it. It tells a story of isolation. And then you go to Green Lantern Secret Origin, and yeah, it's recontextualizing Hal Jordan's origin and tying it into the stuff that we see in The Blackest Night. Here, Superman Secret Origin is essentially just being, well, it's a fix-it retcon. It's a retcon of a retcon. Secret Origin is, by all means, a post-Infinite Crisis origin. During the events of Infinite Crisis, Superboy Prime punches the wall of reality and as such resets a bunch of things. We end up getting Jason Todd back alive, and we end up getting a new origin story. He brings Krypto back to life, essentially, which is funny because Krypto attacks Superboy Prime. So, as such, because this is the reality kind of gets altered, we have 4 new major things that happen. So much like Man of Steel has like 11 things take place, and we have 3 things that kind of happen with Birthright. We have 4 things here, and basically every single one of them is just fixing a problem that they made themselves. And that's kind of DC's methodology, especially when it comes to the Crisis, post-Crisis on Infinite Earths. You're going to get a bunch of fixing the problem that they made themselves. So let's talk about those 4 things really fast. The whole purpose of this story is pretty much that, the reason we have Secret Origin, and that is, number 1, hey, Clark Kent is now Superboy again. That's awesome, I guess. I'm not a big Superboy person, at least Clark Kent, but my Superboy is Connor. So, yeah, Clark, that's cool. For most people, that they wouldn't have read Clark as Superboy, but hey, it's back. Whatever. Basically, the legal issues were kind of getting resolved at this point, and there was less legal dispute of who owned the character of Superboy. It wasn't settled. Spoilers. That's the reason why Superman and New 52, especially Superboy, are really, really weird. Next up, Lex. Now, Lex Luthor did go back to Smallville and Birthright briefly for like a few years, like a year or two at best. Here, he grows up in Smallville, at least with his dad, and he is a major person there. And Clark becomes sort of friends with him, but he's definitely much more of his Silver Age elements. He's a lot more of a mad scientist. His father is a drunkard. They're not wealthy to begin with. He's mostly going to be a self-made villain, and he's dealing with a lot more super science. And yeah, it's Silver Age origin, even to the point where he gets his hair burned off by Clark. I mean, that happens in Birthright, but it happens here too. It's wonderful. I don't know. As I mentioned, Crypto's back. That's cool, but we don't actually see Crypto in the comic. Crypto does not appear in this comic except for a small cameo via picture, but Crypto's here. Next up, and this is a big one for a lot of people, is that Legion now has reestablished its ties with Superboy. Now, this one is actually the big thing that the Superboy problem created. By getting rid of Superboy in Man of Steel, you created a weird paradox situation where Legion of superheroes are supposedly inspired by Superboy. Well, there was never a Superboy. So who were they really inspired by? And they have a weird history of time travel shenanigans and like how reboots work. And they try to rectify it, like Mon-El being the inspiration. And Mon-El's cool, but Mon-El's no Superboy. Legion has a lot of problems post-Crisis. They're the one of the few things that are really damaged by the Crisis. And they never fully, truly recovered. They get their moments here and there, and currently they're having a pretty solid one. But this is the big push. Geoff Johns is trying to write a Legion stuff. He never writes a Legion book, oddly enough, but he ends up writing Legion of Three Worlds during Final Crisis, and this is essentially kind of explaining how that works. So yeah, we see Legion back. That's cool. It's neat. I'm at this time I'm not a big Legion fan, but I have what I've read and came across. I do like it. It's good. I actually like that version of Superboy character. So hey, maybe Legion's where it's at. Maybe this podcast will make me a big Legion fan, make me a big Legionnaire. So, in a lot of ways, ultimately, Secret Origin is the anti-Man of Steel. It pulls the Band-Aid off and basically gets rid of returns all the major Silver Age stuff that Man of Steel eliminates, while keeping the more personality-driven things that really are the big changes at work, like the mom Pa Kent still being alive, Clark being the identity first, Superboy or Superman being secondary. That kind of stuff, yeah, that's more effective, and honestly, that's the best parts of the Man of Steel reboot, and I think that's the stuff that most people resonate with. The Silver Age elements being stripped away kind of eliminates a lot of the fun of Superman, and it's cool to see him back. But I'm not really a big fan of fix-it fiction, and that's really what Secret Origin feels like. So Secret Origin doesn't really do anything new. It's just fixing old things. It's not making a Legion that's different. It's not even the different Legion. It's straight up the same Legion. It's not fixing the Luthor stuff, not adding anything new to Luthor. It's still Luthor. And that's really what I don't like about the comic. When I read Secret Origin at the time, I was like, okay, this is neat. And I didn't get to finish the event because college was happening and I wasn't able to finish the miniseries. But I remember going, this is kind of neat. Then I read it again for the podcast and I'm like, this comic kind of blows. And it's because it doesn't do anything new. The plot is only 6 issues, which is fine. 6 issues is honestly enough to do a Superman origin. I'm not expecting a Birthright situation. But first 2 issues are spent in Smallville with both Clark becoming Superboy and Superboy in the Legion. I get it because those are the big things that are the big changes. Superboy and the Legion stuff being really a big part. The problem comes then that Gary Frank can't draw a child, at least consistently. He's worse than John Byrne when it comes to drawing children, and John Byrne famously cannot draw children. The difference is John Byrne knew he couldn't draw children, and he got out of Smallville pretty quick. He's in Smallville for 1 issue, and they're not even young kids. You see like maybe 3 pages of a baby in there because John Byrne's like, I can't draw children. Part of the reason I think there's a birthing matrix, honestly, is that he does it so he doesn't have to draw a baby. He just to draw like a little yellow sphere, and then yeah, a baby shows up for like a panel, and I can do 1 panel of babies. John Byrne, maybe, probably. Here, Gary Frank gets he gets the confidence that he can draw a bunch of babies and bunch of kids, and they all look terrifying and they're all creepy, and I don't get it, and it makes it look bad. It's a bad looking book. I'm not even a big Gary Frank art fan, and Don't get me wrong, he's not a bad artist. It just doesn't look good here. It's not working in his strengths. So when you get past the first two issues of these Hans Moleman style looking children, you get four more issues of the rest of the series dealing with Clark going to a failing Daily Planet, which is not that interesting. A Luthor that has the biggest god complex of all the Luthors, which is saying something. Luthor is loaded on a god complex. And we also have to deal with two villains, two Superman rogues get introduced in this story in the form of Parasite and a slightly different version of Metallo. We get three villain origins, a Legion story, and also we're dealing with all the Superman things. There's a lot of stuff going on in these 6 issues, but not a lot at the same time. It feels like there's nothing happening, and that's really my big concern and my big qualm with Secret Origin. Secret Origin's main sin is not doing anything new. And it's just the same old song and dance, and it's only 6 years after Birthright when this comes out. It is largely nothing. And on top of that, in about 2 years, you get Flashpoint, and that it gives you 52, the new 52, and the new 52 throws all of this out. And we don't get Superboy again. So all this work has gone away for nothing. Then on top of this, the other thing that doesn't work is the Lois Lane problem. Lois in this comic, I've not talked about yet because Lois in all these origins, the Lois kind of goes like this, by the way. Man of Steel Lois is fantastic. It's different, but it's fantastic. It fits the character. Birthright's Lois is really good. Kind of not perfect. Wade doesn't do a perfect version, the Lois voice perfectly, but he does a good job. It's a good Lois. Jeff Johns, who normally can write a decent Lois Lane, cannot write a Lois Lane in this comic. Lois Lane here is not interesting. This is a Lois Lane that is not fiercely determined. She's not pushing back. She's not being a voice against authority. This is a Lois Lane that is not punching. That is not punching up. The Lois Lane in Secret Origin is a Lois Lane that punches down. This is the Lois Lane that canonically would vote Republican that was established by the DC Comics, which is really weird. She's the only character in the comic who explicitly starts expressing hope. She's the voice that says, I am starting to feel hope again because of Superman. And that's fine. She is deeply cynical, and she does become less cynical as Superman comes along, and that's cool. It's like the reverse, it's kind of like a reverse Hallmark movie, where the small town farmer boy kind of changes the heart of the big city woman. The problem is, she's the only character who says this. We don't see Jimmy Olsen say it. We don't see Perry. We don't see Cat Grant. We don't even see anybody say, man, I can start feeling hope again. We don't see it in the streets. We don't see that, period. Nope, just Lois, because she decided to do a Hallmark movie, essentially. It's dumb, and it's very much of the most reductive version of Lois Lane that you ever see in the comics, until we cover an Elseworld story in a few weeks. But that's beside the point. This is just not a very good Lois Lane. And that really just bugged the piss out of me for this comic. Ugh. Alright, enough ragging on what didn't work. Let's talk about what does work. Let's talk about the standout moments. There's not a lot to talk about here with there's not a lot to talk about here with Secret Origin. And yeah, there's a reason. It's not much going on, nothing much new here. But there is a standout moment I do like. I do like Johns' Luthor. Jeff Johns does write a really good Luthor. He always has, and he always will. If he gets back to writing DC Comics, I feel he will always have a good Luthor. His Luthor is a mixture of the Trumpian Luthor that we see in Man of Steel, alongside the super science style that we see more in Birthright, and obviously with Jeff Lopes and stuff. And while the comic is way too overfilled to the gills, I do like how Johns tries to incorporate the Parasite story into it. I do like Parasite. He's an interesting character. And we do get Metallo, which is fine. Metallo is usually usually one of the early Superman villains in a lot of adaptations and a lot of media for a reason. And he's a bit character, so you really don't need him for a full arc. You can put him in just like a bit, an issue here and there. And that's how they get done. There's an issue for Parasite, and there's the issue for Metallo. And they're really good characters because they do pose challenges for Superman, because they do weaken Superman in some form or fashion. And there's somebody Superman can punch on. It's just, there's a lot going on in this comic, and there's not a lot going on at the same time. It's a lot of nothing happening really fast for nothing. And it feels empty. It's empty calories. But hey, it's cool to see them. Besides, At least it's not evil Kryptonians. That's fine, I guess. All right. I believe it is time to rank Superman Secret Origin. It's, up to be honest here, it's definitely the weakest of the three. In this list is my sole opinion, and I know a lot of people who do like Secret Origin. I've met them, they talk about it, but guys, it is a bad comic. It does a lot of nothing and gets in a hurry to get there, but it does nothing. And I'm not talking about significance of the historical significance. It is, besides being a footnote, it just doesn't do a lot. It doesn't redefine the character for a new era. All of it feels like it's supposed to be throwbacks. All the characters, instead of being modern updates, like we see with Birthright or in Man of Steel, we see Silver Age characters. They're not drawn like real people again. They're drawn like you would see in like a TV show set in the 50s. We see very much period and not, period specific clothing. It's very anachronistic and also not anachronistic. It's trying to be evergreen, but in a way that's not visually interesting. There's no style to it in a way that is compelling. It doesn't do a lot. It doesn't do anything, honestly. To me, this makes the number 3 on the list, and it's currently the worst Superman comic ever. Maybe hyperbole, but I really did not care for Secret Origin. And that's it for the inaugural episode of The Never Ending Battle. Join me next week as we take a look at some Halloween episodes of Superman and go through a journey of the spooky side. You can get your Never Ending Battle every Friday on your favorite podcasting platforms. You can follow the show over at NEB Superman at Blue Sky, my weekly comic reviews over at comicsbeat.com. And you can find the companion article for this episode over at extremelyuncanny.com, as well as the link in the show notes. And if you like the show, be sure to share it with a friend and leave us a review over on iTunes or your various podcasting platforms. It does really help spread the word of the show. And lastly, as always, keep fighting the never-ending battle for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. Thank you all. Have a great night.